Hello and welcome at this webinar about oral history and mills. My name is Ellen Steendam and me and my colleague Marloes Wellenberg will tell you something this afternoon about oral history and the interview project Mill Stories that we recently completed. We are both historians and we work for an organization called Erfgoedhuis Zuid-Holland. Erfgoedhuis is a heritage advisory center funded by the government of the province of South Holland, which is in the west of the Netherlands. Erfgoedhuis does not own any heritage objects or collections itself, but we support volunteers and organizations that do, such as museums, archives, country houses and castles, and city councils and millers and mill owners in our province. We do this by setting up projects and training courses, by organizing symposia, and by giving advice. This summer, we completed our project Mill Stories, in which we interviewed more than 25 people about life and work on the mills in our province, specifically the drainage mills. The results of this project in terms of stories and new insights into daily life and work on the mills have far exceeded our expectations, and we will share some interesting results later on. We will also share advice on how to start your own project and how to share the results with the public. But first, let me tell you about the background of the project. What was the reason to start this project? Some years ago, we conducted research into the yards of drainage mills in our province. South Holland is a very mill-rich province. In recent decades, much attention has been paid to the preservation of mills, in particular to the buildings as a machine. The immediate area, the mill yard, has barely received attention. And that is strange because the yard tells a lot about the functioning of the mill. This applies in particular to the yard of a drainage mill because people actually lived in or near that type of mill. The mill yard is therefore also illustrative of the daily life of the miller and his family. A lot of drainage mills disappeared or decommissioned in the last century. And when the awareness dawned that the mills, which are so characteristic of the Dutch landscape, had to be preserved in order to keep the story of the original landscape alive, these industrial objects were protected by law. That was in the 1960s. However, elements in and around the yard, such as outbuildings, vegetable gardens, or orchards, were not legally protected and thus often disappeared from the landscape. Our research resulted in a guide describing the various elements that are present in the yard. And the purpose of the guide is to share the knowledge gathered on the subject. This can prevent valuable elements from disappearing. The guide is also intended to inspire today's millers to conduct research into their own mill yards. And this contributes to responsible conservation or restoration of elements using appropriate materials and local planting. For our research, we had a lot of conversations with millers, and during these conversations, we noticed that they have much more information, stories, and knowledge available that are not recorded anywhere and have not been structurally disclosed. And also, the generation of drainage millers who have actually worked and lived in the mill is becoming smaller. The generation of children grown up on mills during the last century, often under primitive circumstances without electricity or water, is diminishing too. So this was the reason to start the oral history project Mill Stories, in order to capture all those stories before it is too late.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to start by showing you this definition of oral history. It can be defined as the recording, preservation, and interpretation of historical information based on the personal experiences and opinions of the speaker. It may take the form of eyewitness evidence about the past, but can include folklore, myths, songs, and stories passed down over the years by word of mouth. While it is an invaluable way of preserving the knowledge and understanding of older people, it can also involve interviewing younger generations. And the definition continues with the following slide, that oral history is particularly useful for capturing stories from minority groups or small communities who are not represented in more formal histories. This applies very much to our project, as the Miller families that lived on the drainage mills in the polder are by definition a community that historically has not been represented in official histories. The drainage mills were built to drain the polders, land that is reclaimed from the sea or inland water. And as opposed to many flour mills or industrial mills, the drainage mills were not owned by the miller, but by a joint collective of farmers that owned land in the area. The farmers needed to manage the water levels in the polder and were organized within so-called polder management boards. These polder management boards are a very old form of democracy, instituted to ensure that the inhabitants of a polder were responsible for the maintenance of it. Mostly it was the large landowners and large farmers who sat on these boards, and some of these boards were responsible for large regions. Others were very small scale, with board meetings held in a local pub a few times every year. So back to the millers. The millers of the drainage mills were employed by these boards for what we would now call part-time employment. The wages for the miller were not enough to live on, and they had to look for additional ways to support themselves. And sometimes the miller worked as a day laborer for farmers, or they earned extra money by fishing. Many of the people that we spoke to in this project told us that they grew up in poverty and insecurity, and sometimes felt like second-class citizens between the farmers and landowners that surrounded them. One of them told us, if a miller came into conflict with one of the farmers for some reason, it could happen that the miller was fired and he and his family had to leave the mill immediately. So not only did the miller lose his job, he and his family also lost their house and had to find another place to live. So what we set out to do with our project was to record information and stories about life and work on the mills, and sharing these stories with the miller community and with the public. So how did we do that? We interviewed people at home, recorded the interviews, and had the recording transcribed, which means that everything that is said during the interview is written down. Then we edited the transcripts to make a story that we submitted to the interviewee. They could fact check the story, but could also ask us to remove information. It could happen, for instance, that they were not sure after all about certain statements, or simply because a joke about something or someone that was told in the interview was not particularly suitable in a text. We were able to hire someone to make the transcriptions for us, because that is a very time-consuming process. If you do it manually, it can easily cost you a day or more to transcribe an interview, but it is very useful. And by listening to the interview again, you will often understand much more about and much better what was said. Later this year, we are depositing the audio records in an electronic archive, so that future researchers can have access to the data. And this is also why we needed to make the transcriptions. In the end, we published all stories online. In a way, an interview project is relatively easy to set up, but nevertheless, it was a very time-consuming project. Many of the people we spoke to did not have an email address, for example. So making an appointment with them or after the interview, having them check the text of the story was sometimes a bit of a challenge. In some cases, we had to rely on their family members to help us with the process. So what did we talk about with the Millers? Well, we compiled a questionnaire, and these are some of the subjects we asked about to gain insight into daily life on the mill. Learning the craft, the role of the miller's wife and children. Working hours, we know that many of the drainage millers had to work in the night. And other jobs they had, the layout of the mill yards, traditions, relationship with the farmers in the polder, personal views, did they enjoy being a miller or not, the World War II, and other subjects that were discussed. I will show some interesting quotes from the project now. I will give you a few seconds to read it. Well, we were very interested in the way people learn the craft, but that is typically a subject that is not documented very well. This is a quote from a miller who told us that he was the 7th generation miller in his family, and he had records from a forefather from around 1800 who was already a drainage miller. Still, in this case, his father apparently had to be persuaded somewhat to teach his son the craft, and would rather have waited some years. The next quote, however, shows that other millers had a much more relaxed attitude towards sharing their duties with family members. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to read it. So this man told us, well, operating the mill, it's not really very complicated. We have spoken to many more people who told us that their mother or their siblings operated the mill when their father was away. And that could be quite often because, as we explained earlier, all drainage millers had other jobs to supplement their income and for which they had to leave the mill. In contrast, we spoke to millers who were adamant that it was not formally allowed for anyone other than themselves to operate the mill, and told us that their wife did not have anything to do with the mill at all. However, we have concluded that in many families, operating the mill was a genuine family business. One of the interviewees told us that after his father's death, his mother was formally appointed milleress. She was also taking care of 10 children who were all underage. And he told us that on any given day the mill had to run, it was the sibling with the job that paid least that stayed home to operate the mill. And often they operated the mill at night so they could combine the jobs. Ellen will now show you some more quotes.
Thank you, Marloes. This quote refers to traditional colors, so I'll give you a few seconds to read this quote. The questionnaire we used also consisted of questions about the interior and exterior of the mill. What colors were used, who was responsible for the maintenance, or how many rooms there were. And the theory that this interviewee refers to is quite widely accepted in the miller community. However, many of the people we spoke to have their own ideas about it and refer to costs as a deciding factor. We also inquired about after traditions and intangible heritage. For instance, traditionally, the sails of the mill could be used to communicate certain events. and this language is still used by many volunteer millers. For instance, when there is a wedding or another happy occasion, but also in a period of mourning, when a neighbor has died or relatives of the miller. We know that there are discussions within the volunteer community what the correct period is for such occasions. But we have found that accounts about mourning periods vary greatly. It appears that in certain regions, the period of mourning could be a year, whereas in other areas, people have told us it could be a month. It would be very interesting to collect more data about this, because we know that the volunteer community is very interested in this kind of information. This quote gives us an insight into a relationship between the drainage millers and the farmers that employ them. I will read it aloud for you. Once a year, the farmers that served on the polder management board came to check on the mill. Some of them really did not have a clue. They asked my father, "Klaas, why on earth is the mill not running? It has rained terribly and the water level needs to go down." My father would have to gently explain, "Well, there's no wind today, so the mill cannot run." Stupid questions, of course, but they were in charge, so we could not say that. This quote refers to the World War II. I will give you a few seconds to read the quote. Many of the people we spoke to had stories about the Second World War. The drainage mills were in rural areas and often very isolated. This meant that they could be used to host people in hiding or as a meeting place for the resistance. Later on, we will share some more advice on how to conduct interviews, but I would like to share an example now of how easy it can be to miss valuable stories and information. We interviewed a woman in her 90s who grew up on a mill in an isolated area. When we asked if there were any stories about the war, at first she said no, nothing interesting to tell. She seemed a bit surprised about the question, so we explained that we asked about the war because accounts of people hiding in the mill were relatively common. "Of course," she said, "sure. We had people in hiding too. I thought you were asking after spectacular events, and we did not have any of those." And then she gave more details about the people that were in hiding in the time periods. For us, it was a good reminder that it's important to listen very closely and to assess whether it is necessary to illustrate or explain a question, or whether it's better to go to the next question. Apart from the stories people told us, there were photographs from their family and sometimes objects. One of the families we spoke to still had the grey cap that belonged to their father, and they had also the diary in which he kept notes about the fish that he caught and the supplemented income, and his income, it supplemented it very nicely. The drawing on the left was used by one of the interviewees to illustrate a story that he told us about coming across the foundations of an old mill in his youth. The stories have been edited and approved by the interviewees. Many of the stories are quite long. From our point of view, this is a collection and a source for everyone who wants to know more about the history of the mills. Some people will want to know more about the social history and the role of women and children on the mill. Others are interested in technical aspects of the interior.
So I'll tell you some more about the outcome of our project. We are very happy with the results of the project. All stories are now available online to be used as a resource for volunteer millers, and we know that they are very popular. Many volunteer millers want to know more about the mills in general or about their own mill specifically, and they can use the stories, for example, when preparing for a guided tour. And we also believe that the stories could attract new audiences to the mills. Also, we have recorded information that has not been documented before, and we have gained new insights into life and work on the mills. And we will continue research on those topics. For example, the stories about the many women that played an active role on the mills has led to new research. We created an internship and had a history student delve into this subject and contact local historical societies. The results were very interesting. He found several polders where many women, all of them widows, were formally appointed as millers in the 18th and 19th century. Other topics of interest are regional traditions and intangible heritage. At the moment, we are working on a national research agenda together with the Natural Cultural Heritage Agency. An outcome we did not anticipate was that participation was very meaningful for the participants. When we started this project, we were very grateful when someone agreed to be interviewed. We were happy that people would take time for us and provide us with information. And we still are, of course. But when the transcripts of the interviews were edited into stories, and each participant received a printed booklet with their story, many of them thanked us profusely for writing down their life story. We have also received many phone calls from family members and have heard many stories about the booklets being passed within families. We now know that this is typical for oral history projects, especially when you are interviewing people who were never asked before to tell their story. We concluded our project this summer by producing guidelines with advice on setting up your own project, and we are also now organizing workshops about oral history and interview techniques, specifically for volunteer millers and miller guides, so that they can collect even more mill stories. Well, what is the benefit of choosing oral history as a method? I've shown you this quote before, but I'd like to show it again because it's very useful for capturing stories for minority groups or small communities, especially if there are no other sources to turn to. So if you are considering starting your own project, or perhaps just interviewing one or two people before it's too late, we have listed some practical advice for you. First of all, always record the interview so you can concentrate on listening instead of taking notes. Prepare questions in advance, but be flexible. Every interview is different, and it often happens that one question leads to another, and before you know it, an hour and a half has passed. However, it is very important that you check at the end whether all subjects on your list of questions have been covered and you did not forget anything. Do not interrupt too often, but always speak up if you don't understand something. If you did not hear correctly what the other person said, do not think, oh, I'll check it on my recorder later. Chances are you don't understand it then either. What happens, for instance, is that people use names of persons or places that you do not recognize, or often it is not clear in what chronological order the stories are. In those cases, it is important to ask for clarification. We have found it very helpful to work with two interviewers as a team, but we always divided the roles. Ideally, one person asks the questions, the other person checks whether the recorder is still working, whether a break is needed, or whether everyone whether someone needs a glass of water. This person can also speak up if information is not clear, or can make a note if the interviewee says things like, "Oh, I have some photos about that, and I can show them to you later." In our experience, this works very well. Some more advice. Explain clearly what you are looking for. We have found that many people are very modest and would never participate unless you ask them personally. Some people truly think they do not need to be interviewed because their life was not spectacular. In those cases, it can help if you clearly explain, for instance, that you would like to interview people about daily life and that you would consider them as experts in that. Diversity is also very important because it means that you can document different perspectives, and that is very valuable. We have experienced, for example, that women were typically more hesitant to participate in our project. Thirdly, it is important that people know what they are participating in. We had everyone sign an agreement about the nature of the project, and participants gave us permission to disclose their stories and to archive the recordings. Lastly, I would strongly advise you to get in touch with your local archive to talk about possibilities for storage of your material. So how do you share the stories that you collected with the public? Well, as I said, we published all stories online and shared the results also via social media. We know, as I said, that many volunteer millers use the stories, for example, when they are giving a guided tour. And also several mill organizations have made links on their website to the interviews that have a connection with their mills. We think, whereas in some guided tours, the focus is mainly on the technical workings of the mill, we believe there is also an audience for stories about the history of the mills and the history of the people that lived and worked there. In other words, with the information from the interviews, you can inspire and attract other audiences. We have also found that several mill magazines have approached us to ask if they could publish some of the stories, and several local historical societies have also contacted us to republish interviews in their magazines. And on our Facebook page, we received many reactions to the stories. So we know that there is definitely a lot of interest in mill stories. And I think there are lots more creative ways to use the information that is collected. We have been talking about the possibilities of making a podcast, for instance. Some of our other projects feature oral history. So we have some examples of that might be interesting to you. For this particular project about country estates in the Second World War, we interviewed people that lived and worked on country houses and castles. Many of these estates were claimed by the Germans and were subsequently used, for example, for the housing of soldiers, to build bunkers, or to launch missiles. For this project, we made short videos that we published on Facebook. I suppose you are familiar with the concept of advertising on Facebook, where you can select your target audience, for instance, on the basis of location. So what we did was we selected a location for every video and were able to reach a wide audience this way that was very interested in our content. Many of the people that saw these videos responded that they knew this particular castle or country house because they passed it on their way to work every day. Now they knew more about the history. They were very interested in actually visiting the place. And some of the videos were watched over 50,000 times. One last example is a project about endangered churches. Perhaps you recognize this phenomenon in your own country. In the Netherlands, many churches are forced to close because there are less and less people going to church. That means that many of these beautiful buildings have to be dismantled, or a new purpose needs to be found for them. For a church in Rotterdam, that will probably be sold in the coming year, we teamed up with a local organization and interviewed 20 people about their memories of the church. Memories about their wedding there, funerals they went to, or stories about the priest that worked there through the years. After recording the interviews, a book was made, and snippets from the interviews were combined into a compilation that the participants have listened to together in their church. It was a wonderful project, and we know that it has been very meaningful for many of the participants who are in some cases very sad that their church is closing down. To conclude this presentation, I have another wonderful quote from one of the participants in our project. Jan Neulander was a long-time volunteer miller who came from a long line of millers. Sadly, he died not long after being interviewed, but these words evoke the image of a mill as a living and breathing thing. Jan said, "It is important to keep the mills running. If you stop using the mills, they will become dead. They will lose their soul. I remember how our mill could run back in the days. When there was a strong wind, you could see everything moving, as if the mill was breathing. One of the beams was made of pine wood, and it would start to talk. When the weather was very extreme and the beam would start to roar, my parents looked at each other and laughed. Time for a game of cards." It is a powerful and very beautiful image that makes you look differently the next time you see a mill. A perfect example of the power that stories can have. So thank you very much for your attention, and please do not hesitate to contact us if you have any questions or if you have any stories to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.